How did Alexander the Great escalate his empire from a promising start to an unstoppable force? Get ready to explore Arrian's Anabasis, Book 2, revealing Alexander's empire, the next stage, featuring the legendary Battle of Issus and beyond. After securing his Macedonian base, Alexander faced the ultimate test, the vast, ancient Persian Empire. But how did he, against seemingly impossible odds, outmaneuver and defeat Darius III not once, but twice? What bold strategies at the Battle of Issus changed the course of history? And what surprising moves did he make in Egypt that solidified his Mediterranean power? In this video, we delve into Arrian's meticulous accounts, offering you a front-row seat to the most dramatic period of Alexander's conquests. This is more than just history. It's a masterclass in ancient warfare and leadership. Like this video if you're as fascinated by Alexander as we are, comment below with your thoughts on Issus, and subscribe for more epic journeys through the ancient world. The Anabasis of Alexander, Book 2. Chapter 1. Persian Counteroffensive in the Aegean. Soon after, Memnon, appointed by King Darius as commander of the fleet and the entire seacoast, intended to move the war into Macedonia and Greece. He first took possession of Chios, which was surrendered to him through treachery. From Chios, he sailed to Lesbos and gained control of all its cities except Mytilene, whose inhabitants resisted him. Once these cities were secured, he focused on Mytilene. He cut off the city from the rest of the island by constructing a double stockade from sea to sea. This allowed him to easily dominate the land side by establishing 5 camps. A portion of his fleet guarded Mytilene's harbor, intercepting passing ships. The rest of his fleet guarded Sigrium, a headland of Lesbos, which was the best landing place for trading vessels from Chios, Geriestus, and Malea. This strategy deprived the Mytileneans of all hope of aid by sea. However, Memnon then fell ill and died. His death at this critical moment greatly harmed the king's interests. Nevertheless, Autophrodates and Pharnabazus, son of Artabazus, vigorously continued the siege. Memnon, on his deathbed, had entrusted his command to Pharnabazus, his sister's son, until Darius could make a new decision. Blocked by land and sea, the Mytileneans sent envoys to Pharnabazus and reached an agreement. They would send away the auxiliary troops provided by Alexander, demolish the pillars inscribed with their treaty with Alexander, and become allies of Darius under the terms of the peace made with Persia during the time of Antalcidas. Additionally, their exiles would be allowed to return, receiving half of the property they owned before banishment. Under these terms, the compact was made between the Mytileneans and the Persians. As soon as Pharnabazus and Autophrodates entered the city, they introduced a garrison led by Lycomedes, a Rhodian commandant. They also appointed Diogenes, one of the exiles, as the city's ruler. They then exacted money from the Mytileneans, violently taking a portion from wealthy citizens and levying the rest as a tax on the community. After this, Pharnabazus sailed to Lycia with the Greek mercenaries, while Autophrodates sailed to other islands. Meanwhile, Darius sent Thymondas, son of Mentor, to the coastal regions. His mission was to take over the Greek auxiliaries from Pharnabazus and lead them to the king. He was also to inform Pharnabazus that he would now govern all the territories Memnon had ruled. Pharnabazus handed over the Greek auxiliaries to Thymondas, and then sailed to join Autophrodates and the fleet. When they met, they dispatched Datames, a Persian, with 10 ships to the Cyclades Islands. They themselves, with 100 ships, sailed to Tenedos. Upon arriving at Boreas harbor in Tenedos, they sent a message to the inhabitants. They commanded them to demolish the pillars inscribed with their treaty with Alexander and the Greeks. They were also to observe, concerning Darius, the terms of the peace ratified with the Persian king during Antalcidas's time. The Tenedians preferred to remain allies with Alexander and the Greeks. However, given the current crisis, it seemed impossible to save themselves without yielding to the Persians. Hegelicus, commissioned by Alexander to assemble another naval force, had not yet gathered a fleet large enough to offer speedy assistance. Therefore, Pharnabazus compelled the Tenedians to comply with his demands more from fear than goodwill. Meanwhile, Proteas, son of Andronicus, acting on Antipater's command, succeeded in collecting warships from Euboea and the Peloponnese. This force was intended to protect both the islands and Greece itself, should the foreigners attack by sea, as was rumored. Learning that Datames and 10 ships were moored near Siphnus, Proteas set out by night with 15 ships from Chalcis on the Euripus. Reaching the island of Siphnus at dawn, he spent the day gathering more certain information about the 10 ships' movements, intending to attack the Phoenicians by night to maximize their terror. Having confirmed that Datames was moored at Siphnus, Proteas sailed there while it was still dark. Just at dawn, he caught them by surprise, capturing 8 of their ships and their crews. Datames, with his remaining 2 triremes, stealthily escaped at the beginning of Proteas's attack and safely reached the rest of the Persian fleet. Chapter 2: The Gordian Knot and Anatolian Advance. When Alexander arrived at Gordium, he was eager to visit the citadel, which housed the palace of Gordius and his son Midas. He also wished to see Gordius's wagon and the famous cord that bound the yoke. This wagon was the subject of much local legend. The story goes that Gordius, a poor ancient Phrygian farmer, had 2 yokes of oxen, one for plowing and one for his wagon. One day, while he was plowing, an eagle landed on the yoke and remained there until the oxen were unyoked. Alarmed by this divine sign, Gordius went to the Telmician soothsayers for guidance. The Telmicians were known for interpreting divine manifestations, and their gift of divination passed down through generations. As Gordius drove his wagon near a Telmician village, he met a maiden fetching water. He told her about the eagle. As she was also from a prophetic family, she instructed him to return to that very spot and offer a sacrifice to King Zeus. Gordius asked her to accompany him to direct the sacrifice. He followed her instructions, and afterward they married. They had a son named Midas, who grew to be handsome and brave. At this time, the Phrygians were troubled by civil discord. Consulting an oracle, they were told that a wagon would bring them a king who would end their troubles. While they were still deliberating, Midas arrived with his parents, stopping near the assembly in the very wagon in question. Interpreting the oracle to refer to him, they appointed Midas king. He ended their discord and dedicated his father's wagon in the citadel as a thank-off to King Zeus for sending the eagle. Additionally, a rumor circulated about the wagon. Whoever could loosen the cord binding the yoke was destined to rule Asia. The cord, made of cornel bark, had no discernible beginning or end. Some accounts say that Alexander, unable to find a way to loosen the cord, yet unwilling to leave it untied, lest it cause unrest among the populace, struck it with his sword and cut it through, declaring it untied. Aristobulus, however, claims Alexander pulled out the wooden pin of the wagon pole, which held the cord together, and then removed the yoke. I cannot confidently confirm how Alexander accomplished this feat nevertheless. Both he and his troops departed from the wagon, as if the oracle concerning the cord's untying had been fulfilled. That very night, thunder and lightning, signs from heaven, confirmed its fulfillment. For this reason, Alexander offered sacrifices the next day to the gods who had revealed the signs and assured him the cord had been properly untied. The next day, Alexander sent envoys to Ancyra in Galatia. There, he met with an embassy from the Paphlagonians, who offered to surrender their nation and form an alliance, requesting that he not invade their land. Alexander commanded them to submit to Calla, the viceroy of Phrygia. Marching into Cappadocia, he subjugated all the territory on this side of the Halys River and much beyond it. He appointed Sabictus as viceroy of Cappadocia, and then advanced to the gates of Cilicia. Upon reaching the camp of Cyrus, mentioned by Xenophon, and seeing the gates heavily guarded, he left Parmenio there with the more heavily armed infantry regiments. Around the first watch, Alexander, taking the shield-bearing guards, archers, and Agrianians, advanced by night to the gates to surprise the guards. His advance was noticed, but his boldness served him well. The guards, seeing Alexander approaching in person, abandoned their posts and fled. At dawn the next day, he passed through the gates with all his forces and descended into Cilicia. Here, he learned that Arzames had initially intended to hold Tarsus for the Persians. However, upon hearing Alexander had already passed through the gates, Arzames resolved to abandon the city. The Tarsians feared he would plunder their city before evacuating. Hearing this, Alexander led his cavalry and the lightest of his light infantry on a forced march to Tarsus. Consequently, Arzames, learning of Alexander's rapid approach, fled swiftly from Tarsus to King Darius without inflicting any damage on the city. Alexander then fell ill, according to Aristobulus, from his exertions. Other authors say that while overheated and heavily perspiring, he jumped into the Cydnus River, eager to bathe. This river flows through the city, originating in Mount Taurus and passing through a clean district, making its water cold and clear. Alexander was seized with convulsions, high fever, and continuous sleeplessness. None of the physicians believed he would survive, except Philip, an Acarnanian, the king's trusted physician, who also enjoyed a good reputation in the army generally. Philip wished to administer a purgative draught, and the king ordered him to do so. While Philip prepared the cup, a letter arrived from Parmenio, warning Alexander to beware of Philip. Parmenio had heard the physician was bribed by Darius to poison Alexander with medicine. Alexander read the letter, held it, and then took the cup containing the medicine, handing Philip the letter to read. While Philip read Parmenio's warning, Alexander drank the potion. It immediately became clear to the king that the physician was acting honorably, for Philip was not alarmed by the letter. Instead, he simply urged the king even more strongly to obey all other prescriptions he might give, promising that his life would be saved if he followed the instructions. Alexander was purged by the drought, and his illness took a favorable turn. He later proved his trust in Philip as a faithful friend. To those around him, he demonstrated perfect confidence in his friends by refusing to entertain any suspicion of their loyalty, and at the same time, he showed he could face death with fearless courage. After this, Alexander sent Parmenio to the other gates separating Cilicia from Assyria to capture and guard the pass before the enemy could. He gave him the allied infantry, Greek mercenaries, Thracians under Cytalus' command, and the Thessalian cavalry. Alexander then marched from Tarsus, arriving on the first day at Anchialus. Reportedly founded by Sardanapalus the Assyrian, its circumference and wall foundations clearly indicated a large and powerful city. Near Anchialus's wall stood Sardanapalus' monument, topped with a statue of the king with hands joined as if clapping. An inscription in Assyrian characters, asserted by Assyrians to be in meter, read, "Sardanapalus, son of Anaxandaraxes, built Anchialus and Tarsus in one day. But do thou, O stranger, eat, drink, and play, since all other human things are not worth this." This referred, like a riddle, to the empty sound made by clapping hands. It was also said that the word translated as play had a more lewd meaning in Assyrian. From Anchialus, Alexander went to Soli, where he introduced a garrison and imposed a fine of 200 talents of silver on the inhabitants for favoring the Persians. Then, taking 3 regiments of Macedonian infantry, all the archers and the Agrianians, he marched against the Cilicians holding the mountains. In 7 days, he expelled some by force and negotiated with others, returning to Soli. There, he learned that Ptolemy and Isander had overcome Orontabates, the Persian guarding the citadel of Halicarnassus, who also held Myndus, Caunus, Thera, and Callipolis. Kos and Triopium had also been subdued. They informed him that Oronobates had been decisively defeated in a major battle, with about 700 of his infantry and 50 of his cavalry killed, and no less than 1,000 taken prisoner. In Soli, Alexander offered a sacrifice to Asclepius, leading a procession of the entire army, celebrating a torch race, and overseeing gymnastic and musical contests. He granted the Saulians a democratic constitution and then marched to Tarsus, sending the cavalry under Philotas through the Aeolian plain to the Pyramus River. Alexander himself, with the infantry and the royal squadron of cavalry, went to Megarsus, where he offered sacrifice to Megarsian Athena. From there, he marched to Malas, where he honored Amphilochus with the sacrificial rites due to a hero. He also arrested those creating sedition among the citizens, thus quelling the unrest. He remitted the tribute they paid to King Darius because the Maleotes were a colony of the Argives, and he himself claimed descent from Argos, being a descendant of Heracles. Chapter 3. March to Issus and Battle Preparations. While still at Malos, Alexander learned that Darius was encamped with his full forces at Sochi in Assyria, about a 2-day march from the Assyrian gates. Alexander gathered his companions and informed them of Darius's reported position and army. They urged him to advance immediately. He commended them and ended the conference. The next day, he led his forces toward Darius and the Persians. On the second day, he passed through the gates and encamped near Myrandus. However, a severe tempest and violent storm of wind and rain that night kept him in his camp. Darius, on the other hand, had been at Sochi for a long time. He had chosen a vast, open plain in Assyria, ideal for his immense army and cavalry maneuvers. Amyntas, son of Antiochus, a deserter from Alexander, advised Darius not to leave this position, as it offered ample space for the vast Persian multitude and their baggage. Darius initially agreed. However, Alexander's prolonged stay in Tarsus due to illness, his stop in Soli for sacrifices and military processions, and his campaign against the Cilician mountaineers caused Darius to waver. He was easily swayed by advice that aligned with his own desires. Influenced by courtiers who offered pleasant but unhelpful counsel, for kings often have such advisors, Darius concluded that Alexander no longer wished to advance, and was retreating upon learning of Darius's approach. Everyone urged Darius forward, asserting he would crush the Macedonian army with his cavalry. Still, Amyntas confidently affirmed that Alexander would certainly come to any place where he heard Darius might be, exhorting him to remain in his current position. But the more agreeable, though poorer, advice prevailed. Moreover, some divine influence seemed to guide Darius to a location where his vast cavalry and sheer numbers of men, javelins, and bows would be useless. He could not even display his army's magnificence, instead delivering an easy victory to Alexander. Fate, it seemed, had already decreed that the Macedonians would wrest control of Asia from the Persians, just as the Persians had taken it from the Medes, and the Medes from the Assyrians before them. Darius crossed the mountain range via the Ammonic gates and advanced toward Issus, arriving unnoticed behind Alexander. At Issus, he captured and cruelly mutilated and killed Macedonians left behind due to illness. The next day, he proceeded to the Phaneris River. As soon as Alexander heard Darius was in his rear, he initially doubted the news. He put some companions on a 30-oared ship and sent them back to Issus to verify the report. The ship's crew easily spotted the Persian encampment, as the sea there formed a bay. They returned to Alexander with confirmation. Darius was close by. Alexander then gathered his generals, cavalry commanders, and leaders of the Greek allies. He exhorted them to draw courage from their past victories, asserting that this fight would be between those who had already triumphed and a foe already defeated. He declared that divine intervention was serving them better than he could, by prompting Darius to move his forces from a spacious plain and confine them in a narrow space. Here, the Macedonians could deepen their phalanx by marching from front to rear, while the Persians' vast numbers would be useless in battle. He added that their foes were inferior in both strength and courage. The Macedonians, long hardened by dangerous warfare, would face Persians and Medes, men enervated by luxurious ease. Above all, they as free men would fight against slaves. He further noted that the Greeks in the two armies would not be fighting for the same goals. Those with Darius braved danger for meager pay, while those on their side voluntarily defended Greek interests. Moreover, the Thracians, Paeonians, Illyrians, and Agrianians, Europe's most robust and warlike men, would be arrayed against Asia's most sluggish and effeminate races. And finally, Alexander himself was commanding against Darius. He listed these points as evidence of their superiority, and then outlined the great rewards of the impending danger. He told them that on this day, they would overcome not merely Darius's viceroys, nor the cavalry at the Granicus, nor 20,000 Greek mercenaries, but all the available forces of the Persians and Medes, along with all other subject races in Asia, and the great king himself. After this battle, nothing would remain but to take possession of all Asia and end their many labors. Additionally, he reminded them of their brilliant collective achievements in the past. If any man had individually performed a distinguished act of valor for glory, Alexander mentioned him by name to commend the deed. He then recounted his own daring acts in various battles as modestly as possible. He is also said to have reminded them of Xenophon and his 10,000 men, asserting that his own troops were far superior in both number and general excellence. Xenophon's men had lacked Thessalian, Boeotian, Peloponnesian, Macedonian, or Thracian horsemen, or any other cavalry present in Alexander's army. They also had no archers or slingers, except a few Cretans and Rhodians, who Xenophon had hastily assembled in the midst of danger. Yet, even these had routed the king and all his forces near Babylon and reached the Euxine Sea, defeating all races in their path. Alexander also used other arguments suitable for a great commander to encourage brave men at such a critical moment before battle. They urged him to lead them against the foe without delay, gathering from all sides to grasp the king's right hand and promising their full support. Alexander then ordered his soldiers to eat dinner. Having sent a few horsemen and archers forward to the gates to reconnoiter the rear road, he took his entire army and marched by night to reoccupy the pass. Around midnight, having secured it, he allowed the army to rest the remainder of the night on the rocks, after posting vigilant sentries. At dawn, he began descending the pass along the road. As long as the space remained narrow, he led his army in a column. But when the mountains parted to reveal a plain, he began to extend the column into a phalanx, bringing line after line of heavy-armed infantry up into position, toward the mountain on the right and toward the sea on the left. Until this point, his cavalry had been behind the infantry. But when they advanced into the open country, he began to arrange his army for battle. First, on the right wing near the mountain, he placed his infantry guard and the shield-bearers, commanded by Nicanor, son of Parmenio. Next to them were Caenus's regiment, and then Perdiccas's, extending to the middle of the heavy-armed infantry from the right. On the left wing stood Aminas's regiment, then Ptolemy's, and then Meleager's. The infantry on the left was commanded by Craterus, but Parmenio had overall command of the entire left wing. Parmenio had been ordered not to abandon the sea, to prevent being outflanked by the numerically superior foreign forces. As soon as Darius was certain of Alexander's approach for battle, he moved about 30,000 of his cavalry and 20,000 light-armed infantry across the Panaris River to allow him to easily array the rest of his forces. Among the heavy-armed infantry, he first positioned 30,000 Greek mercenaries opposite the Macedonian phalanx. On both sides of these, he placed 60,000 men called Cardaces, also heavy-armed infantry. The ground where they were positioned could only accommodate this number in a single phalanx. He also posted 20,000 men near the mountain on their left, facing Alexander's right. Some of these troops were even to Alexander's rear, because the mountain here sloped significantly backward, forming a kind of bay, and then curved forward, placing the troops at its base behind Alexander's right wing. The remaining multitude of Darius's light-armed and heavy-armed infantry were marshaled by nations to an unserviceable depth, positioned behind the Greek mercenaries and the Persian army. Darius's entire army was said to number about 600,000 fighting men. As Alexander advanced, he found the ground widened slightly, and he brought up his cavalry, the Campanians, Thessalians, and Macedonians, positioning them with himself on the right wing. He sent the Peloponnesians and the rest of the Greek allied forces to Parmenio on the left. When Darius had arrayed his phalanx, he recalled the cavalry he had posted in front of the river, using a prearranged signal to facilitate his army's arrangement. Most of these he placed on the right wing near the sea, facing Parmenio, as this ground was more suitable for cavalry maneuvers. A part of them also led up the mountain toward the left. But when they proved useless there due to the narrowness of the ground, he ordered most of these to ride around to the right wing and join their comrades. Darius himself occupied the center of the entire army, as was customary for Persian kings, a placement Xenophon, son of Gryllus, had recorded the reason for. Meanwhile, Alexander observed that nearly all the Persian cavalry had shifted to his left, toward the sea, leaving only the Peloponnesians and the rest of the Greek cavalry there. He swiftly sent the Thessalian cavalry to that wing, ordering them not to ride along the front of the formation, lest the enemy detect their movement, but to proceed stealthily behind the phalanx. In front of the cavalry on the right, he positioned the lancers under Pertomachus and the Paeonians under Aristo. Of the infantry, the archers were led by Antiochus, and the Agrianians by Attalus. Some cavalry and archers were also drawn up at an angle to the center, facing the mountain in the rear. Thus, his phalanx on the right was divided into two wings, one facing Darius and the main Persian force across the river, and the other facing those positioned on the mountain to their rear. On the left wing, the infantry, consisting of Cretan archers and Thracians under Cytalus, were positioned in front, with cavalry to their left. The Greek mercenaries were arrayed as a reserve for all. Perceiving that the phalanx on the right was too thin, and that the Persians would likely outflank him significantly there, he ordered 2 squadrons of companion cavalry, the Anthemusian, captained by Paroedas, son of Menestheus, and the Legion, commanded by Pantordinus, son of Cleander, to move from the center to the right without being seen. He also moved archers, some Agrianians, and some Greek mercenaries along his right flank at the front, extending his phalanx beyond the Persian wing. When those positioned on the mountain did not descend, Alexander ordered a charge by a few Agrianians and archers, which easily routed them from the base of the mountain. As they fled to the summit, he decided he could use the men who had been holding them in check to fill the ranks of his phalanx, deeming it sufficient to post 300 horsemen to watch the men on the mountain. Chapter 4: Battle of Issus and its Outcomes. Having arranged his forces, Alexander allowed them to rest before advancing, as he observed the enemy's slow approach. Darius was not leading his foreign troops as he had initially positioned them. Instead, he remained on the riverbank, which was mostly steep and precipitous. In places where it was easier to ascend, he had extended a stockade. This immediately indicated to Alexander's men that Darius was losing courage. When the armies finally met, Alexander rode among his troops, urging them to show their valor. He praised, by name, not only the generals but also the captains of cavalry and infantry, and the most distinguished Greek mercenaries. From all sides arose a shout, "No delay, attack the enemy!" At first, he led them forward in a close, measured step, even with Darius's forces in full view. This was to prevent any part of the phalanx from breaking formation. But when they came within dart range, Alexander and those around him on the right wing charged first into the river at a run. His aim was to unnerve the Persians with the speed of their attack, and to quickly engage in hand-to-hand combat to minimize damage from archers. It unfolded exactly as Alexander had anticipated. As soon as the battle became close quarters, the part of the Persian army on the left wing was routed. Here, Alexander and his men achieved a brilliant victory. However, the Greek mercenaries serving Darius attacked the Macedonians where they saw their phalanx most disordered. The Macedonian phalanx had indeed been broken and disjointed toward the right wing, because Alexander had eagerly charged into the river, engaging in close combat and already driving back the Persians there. But the Macedonians in the center did not advance with equal speed. Finding many parts of the bank steep and treacherous, they could not maintain the phalanx's formation. Here, the struggle was desperate. Darius's Greek mercenaries aimed to push the Macedonians back into the river and reclaim victory, even as their own forces were already fleeing. The Macedonians aimed not to fall short of Alexander's already evident good fortune, and not to tarnish the glory of their phalanx, which until then had been considered invincible. Moreover, the rivalry between the Greek and Macedonian races fueled both sides. Here, Ptolemy, son of Seleucus, fell after proving himself a valiant man, along with about 120 other respected Macedonians. Thereupon, the regiments on the right wing, seeing that the Persians opposing them had already been routed, wheeled around toward Darius's Greek mercenaries, and their own hard-pressed detachment. Driving the Greeks away from the river, they extended their phalanx beyond the broken side of the Persian army and began to attack the Greeks on the flank, cutting them down. Meanwhile, the Persian cavalry opposite the Thessalians did not remain on the other side of the river during the struggle. They crossed the water and launched a vigorous attack on the Thessalian squadrons. A fierce cavalry battle ensued here, as the Persians did not give way until they saw Darius flee, and the Greek mercenaries cut off and separated from them by the phalanx. Then, at last, the flight of all the Persians became obvious. Their horses suffered greatly in the retreat because the riders were heavily armed. The horsemen themselves, so numerous and retreating in panicked terror without order along narrow roads, were trampled and injured as much by each other as by the pursuing enemy. The Thessalians also pursued them vigorously, resulting in no fewer cavalry than infantry slaughtered in the flight. But as soon as Alexander terrified and routed Darius's left wing, and the Persian king realized this part of his army was severed from the rest, he immediately began to flee in his chariot, just as he was. He was carried safely by chariot as long as he encountered level ground. But when he came upon ravines and rough terrain, he abandoned the chariot, stripping off his shield and Median mantle. He even left his bow in the chariot and continued his flight on horseback. The night, which soon followed, alone saved him from capture by Alexander. For as long as there was daylight, Alexander pursued him at full speed. But when it grew dark and the ground became invisible, he returned to the camp, having captured Darius's chariot with his shield, Median mantle, and bow. His pursuit had been too slow to overtake Darius because, although he had wheeled around at the first breaking of the phalanx, he did not turn to pursue him until he saw that the Greek mercenaries and Persian cavalry had been driven away from the river. Among the Persians killed were Arzames, Rheomithers, and Atizes, who had commanded the cavalry at the Granicus. Sabaces, viceroy of Egypt, and Bubaces, a Persian dignitary, were also killed, along with about 100,000 common soldiers, including more than 10,000 cavalry. The slaughter was so great that Ptolemy, son of Lagus, who accompanied Alexander, recounts that those pursuing Darius came to a ravine, filled it with corpses, and thus passed over it. Darius's camp was immediately taken in the first assault. It contained his mother, his wife, who was also his sister, and his infant son. His 2 daughters and a few other women, wives of Persian nobles attending them, were also captured. The other Persians had already sent their women and property to Damascus because Darius had sent most of his money and all the luxuries a great king took on campaign to that city. Consequently, no more than 3,000 talents were captured in the camp. Soon after, the money in Damascus was also seized by Parmenio, who was dispatched there for that purpose. This was the outcome of this famous battle, fought in the month of Maimacterian, when Nicostratus was archon of the Athenians. The next day Alexander, despite a sword wound in his thigh, visited the wounded. He collected the bodies of the slain and gave them a splendid burial, with all his forces brilliantly arrayed in battle order. He also praised those he had seen perform gallantly in battle, and those whose exploits he had heard about and fully corroborated. He honored each of them individually with a monetary gift proportionate to their merit. He then appointed Balacrus, son of Nicanor, one of the royal bodyguards, as viceroy of Cilicia. In his place among the bodyguards, he chose Menes, son of Dionysius. In place of Ptolemy, son of Seleucus, who died in battle, he appointed Polysperchon, son of Simmias, to command a brigade. He remitted the 50 talents still due from the Salians as a fine and returned their hostages. Nor did he neglect Darius's mother, wife, and children. Some historians of Alexander say that on the very night he returned from pursuing Darius, entering the Persian king's tent, which had been chosen for his use, he heard the lamentation of women and similar noises not far from the tent. Inquiring who the women were and why they were so close, he was told, "O king, the mother, wife, and children of Darius are lamenting him as slain, having been informed that you possess his bow, royal mantle, and shield." When Alexander heard this, he sent Leonidas, one of his companions, to them with instructions to tell them, "Darius is still alive." In his flight, He left his arms and mantle in the chariot. These are the only things of his that Alexander has. Leonidas entered the tent and delivered the news about Darius, adding that Alexander would allow them to retain their royal status, retinue, and queenly titles. For he had not undertaken the war against Darius out of hatred, but conducted it legitimately for the empire of Asia. Such are the statements of Ptolemy and Aristobulus. But there is another report. The following day, Alexander himself entered the tent, accompanied only by Hephaestion, one of his companions. Darius's mother, unsure which of them was the king, as they were similarly dressed, approached Hephaestion, who appeared taller, and prostrated herself before him. When he drew back and one of her attendants pointed out Alexander as the king, she was ashamed of her mistake and began to withdraw. But the king told her she had made no mistake, for Hephaestion was also an Alexander. I record this without being sure of its truth, nor thinking it entirely unreliable. If it truly occurred, I commend Alexander for his compassionate treatment of the women, his confidence in his companion, and the honor bestowed on him. But if it merely seems probable to historians that Alexander would have acted and spoken thus, even for this reason, I think him worthy of commendation. Chapter 5. Subjugation of Phoenicia and Egypt. Darius fled through the night with a few attendants. By day, he gathered Persian and Greek mercenaries who had escaped the battle, totaling about 4,000 men. He then force-marched towards Thapsacus and the Euphrates River, eager to put the river between himself and Alexander. Meanwhile, a group of deserters, Amyntas son of Antiochus, Thymondas son of Mentor, Aristomedes the Phrygian, and Biener the Acarnanian, fled with about 8,000 soldiers. They passed through the mountains and reached Tripolis in Phoenicia. There, they seized the ships they had previously used to sail from Lesbos. They launched enough vessels for their escape and burned the rest in the docks to prevent Alexander from quickly pursuing them. They first fled to Cyprus, then to Egypt, where Amyntas was soon killed by the locals after meddling in political disputes. At the same time, Pharnabazus and Autophrodates were near Chios. After establishing a garrison there, they dispatched some ships to Kos and Halicarnassus. With 100 of their best sailing vessels, they sailed to Cyphnis. Agis, king of the Lacedaemonians, met them with one trireme, seeking funds for the war and urging them to send a large naval and military force with him to the Peloponnese. News of the battle of Issus reached them just then. Alarmed, Pharnabazus sailed to Chios with 12 triremes and 1,500 Greek mercenaries, fearing the Chians might revolt upon hearing of the Persian defeat. Agis received 30 talents of silver and 10 triremes from Autophrodates. He sent Hippias to deliver these ships to his brother Agesilaus at Taenarum, instructing Agesilaus to fully pay the sailors and then sail quickly to Crete to set things in order there. Agis himself remained among the islands for a time before joining Autophrodates at Halicarnassus. Alexander appointed Menon, son of Surdimas, as viceroy of Coele-Syria, assigning him the cavalry of the Greek allies to guard the country. Alexander then proceeded towards Phoenicia. On his march, he was met by Strato, son of Gerostratus, king of the Aradians and their neighbors. Gerostratus himself, along with other Phoenician and Cyprian kings, was serving in the fleet with Autophrodates. Strato presented Alexander with a golden crown, promising to surrender both the island of Aradus and the prosperous city of Marathus on the mainland opposite Aradus, as well as Sigon, the city of Mariam, and all other territories under his and his father's dominion. While Alexander was still in Marathus, ambassadors arrived with a letter from Darius. They pleaded with Alexander to return Darius's mother, wife, and children, and were instructed to verbally support this petition. The letter reminded Alexander of the friendship and alliance between Philip and Artaxerxes. It stated that Philip was the first to act unjustly towards Arses, son of Artaxerxes, even though the Persians had inflicted no injury. Darius argued that Alexander, since becoming king, had not sought to confirm the long-standing friendship and alliance. Instead, Alexander had crossed into Asia with his army and caused great harm to the Persians. Darius asserted he had come in person to defend his country and preserve his ancestral empire. Regarding the battle, he claimed it was decided by the will of some god. Now, as a king, he begged for his captured wife, mother, and children from another king. He expressed a desire for friendship and alliance with Alexander, requesting that Alexander send Meniscus and Arsamas, the Persian messengers, back with men to exchange pledges of fidelity. Alexander wrote a reply and sent Thersippus with Darius's messengers, instructing him to deliver the letter, but to avoid any conversation. Alexander's letter read, "Your ancestors invaded Macedonia and the rest of Greece, treating us poorly without any prior injury from us. I, appointed commander-in-chief of the Greeks, and wishing to take revenge on the Persians, crossed into Asia because you initiated hostilities. You aided the Perinthians, who wronged my father. Achus sent forces into Thrace, which was under our rule. My father was killed by conspirators you instigated, as you yourself have boasted in your letters. After slaying Arsas and Bagoas, unjustly seizing the throne contrary to Persian law, and ruling your subjects unfairly, you sent hostile letters about me to the Greeks, urging them to wage war against me. You also dispatched money to the Lacedaemonians and some other Greeks, but none of the states accepted it except the Lacedaemonians. As your agents destroyed my friends and sought to dissolve the league I formed among the Greeks, I took the field against you, because you were the aggressor. Since I have defeated your generals and viceroys in the previous battle, and now yourself and your forces in like manner, I am, by the gift of the gods, in possession of your land. I am protecting as many of your soldiers as were not killed, but fled to me for refuge. They are with me voluntarily, serving in my army. Therefore come to me, as I am lord of all Asia. If you fear harsh treatment, send some of your friends to receive pledges of safety from me. Come to me then, and ask for your mother, wife, children, and anything else you wish. Whatever you ask, you will receive, nothing shall be denied you. But in the future, when you send me as the king of Asia. Do not address your wishes to me as an equal. If you are in need of anything, speak to me as the man who is lord of all your territories. If you act otherwise, I shall treat you as an evildoer. If you dispute my right to the kingdom, stay and fight another battle for it, but do not run away. For wherever you may be, I intend to march against you." This was the letter he sent to Darius. When Alexander learned that all the money Darius had sent to Damascus with Cophen, son of Artabazus, was captured, along with the Persians guarding it and other royal property, he ordered Parmenio to take the treasure back to Damascus and guard it. He also learned that the Greek ambassadors who had reached Darius before the battle had been captured. He ordered them sent to him. They were Euthicles, a Spartan, Thessaliscus, son of Ismenias and Dionysodorus, an Olympic victor, both Thebans, and Iphicrates, son of the general Iphicrates, an Athenian. When these men came to Alexander, he immediately released Thessaliscus and Dionysodorus, despite their Theban origin. This was partly out of compassion for Thebes, and partly because their actions seemed pardonable. Their native city had been enslaved by the Macedonians, and they were seeking aid for themselves, and perhaps their city, from Darius and the Persians. Thinking compassionately of both, he released them. He stated that he dismissed Thessaliscus specifically out of respect for his distinguished Theban lineage. Dionysodorus was released because he was an Olympic victor. Iphicrates remained in Alexander's attendance as long as he lived, treated with special honor out of friendship for Athens and remembrance of his father's glory. When Iphicrates died soon after from illness, Alexander sent his bones back to his relatives in Athens. But Euthicles was initially kept in custody, though without chains. This was because he was a Lacedaemonian from a city openly and notably hostile to Alexander at that time, and Alexander found nothing in the man personally to warrant his pardon. Later, after achieving great success, Alexander even released Euthicles. Alexander set out from Marathus and took possession of Byblus in terms of capitulation, and similarly Sidon, whose inhabitants invited him spontaneously due to their hatred of the Persians and Darius. From there, he advanced towards Tyre. Ambassadors from Tyre, dispatched by the Commonwealth, met him on the march, announcing that the Tyrians had decided to obey whatever he commanded. He commended both the city and its ambassadors, and ordered them to return and tell the Tyrians that he wished to enter their city and offer sacrifice to Heracles. The son of the Tyrian king was among the ambassadors, along with other prominent Tyrians, but King Azamilchus himself was sailing with Autophrodates. Chapter 6: The Siege and Capture of Tyre. Alexander's demand to sacrifice at Tyre stemmed from the city's ancient temple of Heracles. This temple was not dedicated to the Argive Heracles, son of Alcmena. The Tyrian Heracles was honored many generations before Cadmus founded Thebes, and before the birth of Semele, Dionysus' mother. The Argive Heracles lived around the time of Oedipus, son of Laius. The Egyptians also worshipped a different Heracles, not the one revered by Tyrians or Greeks. Herodotus states that Egyptians considered Heracles one of their 12 gods, just as Athenians worshipped a different Dionysus, son of Zeus and Kore, to whom the mystic Iacchus chant was sung. Similarly, I believe the Heracles honored in Tartessus by the Iberians, whose pillars bear his name, is the Tyrian Heracles. Tartessus was a Phoenician colony, and its temple and sacrifices followed Phoenician customs. The historian Hecataeus states that Geriants, whose oxen the Argive Heracles was sent to retrieve, had no connection to Iberia or any island called Erythea beyond the Great Sea. Instead, Geriants was king of the mainland around Ambracia and the Amphilochians. Heracles drove the oxen from this Epirus, a significant feat. This part of the mainland is still rich in pastures and fine oxen. It's plausible that the fame of Epirus' oxen and King Geriants reached Eurystheus. However, I doubt Eurystheus would know the name of an Iberian king, Europe's most distant nation, or its cattle. Unless, that is, someone introduced Hera into the account, suggesting she gave these commands to Heracles through Eurystheus, using fables to disguise an incredible tale. Alexander declared his wish to offer sacrifice to this Tyrian Heracles. When the ambassadors delivered this message, the Tyrians decreed they would obey any other command from Alexander, but would not admit any Persian or Macedonian into their city. They believed this was the most reasonable response under the circumstances and the safest course given the uncertain outcome of the war. When Alexander received Tyre's reply, he angrily sent the ambassadors back. He then summoned his companions, army leaders, and infantry and cavalry captains to a council, and spoke as follows. Friends and allies, an expedition to Egypt will not be safe as long as the Persians control the sea. Nor is it safe for us for various reasons, especially considering the situation in Greece, to pursue Darius while leaving Tyre's loyalty uncertain and Egypt and Cyprus under Persian occupation. I fear that while we advance towards Babylon in pursuit of Darius, the Persians might reconquer the coastal areas and transfer the war to Greece with a larger army. The Lacedaemonians are now openly fighting us, and Athens is restrained more by fear than by goodwill. But if Tyre were captured, all of Phoenicia would be ours. The Phoenician fleet, the largest and best in the Persian navy, would likely join us. Phoenician sailors will not risk their lives for others when their own cities are occupied by us. After this, Cyprus will either yield immediately or be easily captured upon the arrival of a naval force. Then, navigating the sea with Macedonian and Phoenician ships, and with Cyprus under our control, we will gain absolute naval supremacy. At the same time, an expedition into Egypt will become easy. Once Egypt is subdued, we will no longer worry about Greece or our homeland. We can then safely undertake the expedition to Babylon with greater prestige, having cut off all maritime provinces and all land west of the Euphrates from the Persian Empire. With this speech, he easily persuaded his officers to attack Tyre. He was also encouraged by a divine sign. That very night, in his sleep, he dreamed of approaching the Tyrian walls, and Heracles seemed to take his right hand and lead him into the city. Aristander interpreted this to mean that Tyre would be captured with great effort, as Heracles' deeds were always accomplished with labor. Indeed, the siege of Tyre proved to be a massive undertaking. The city was an island, fortified with high walls. Naval operations initially favored the Tyrians, as the Persians still controlled the sea, and the Tyrians themselves had many ships. However, Alexander's arguments prevailed, and he resolved to build a mole from the mainland to the city. The strait was narrow and full of pools. Near the mainland, the water was shallow and muddy, but closer to the city, the channel's deepest part was about 3 fathoms deep. There was an abundant supply of stones and wood, which they placed atop the stones. Stakes were easily driven into the mud, which also acted as a cement to secure the stones. The Macedonians worked with great zeal, intensified by Alexander's presence. He led in everything, inspiring men with speeches and monetary gifts, easing the labor of those who toiled harder to gain praise. As long as the mole was built near the mainland, work progressed easily and quickly. Material was poured into shallow water, and there was no opposition. But as they neared deeper water and the city itself, they suffered greatly. Missiles rained down from the high walls, which had been designed for defense, not just construction. Moreover, as the Tyrians still controlled the sea, their triremes repeatedly sailed to various parts of the mole, making it impossible for the Macedonians to deposit material in many places. The Macedonians then erected 2 towers on the mole, which now extended far into the sea. They placed war engines on these towers. Skins and hides covered the front to protect against fire-bearing missiles and shield workers from arrows. This also ensured that Tyrians sailing near to disrupt construction would not easily retreat, as they would be assailed by missiles from the towers. To counter this, the Tyrians devised a plan. They filled a horse transport vessel with dry twigs and other combustible wood. They fixed 2 masts on the prow and built a large circular enclosure to hold as much chaff and as many torches as possible. They also placed pitch, brimstone, and other flammable materials on the vessel. They stretched a double yardarm on each mast, from which they hung cauldrons filled with materials designed to create a far-reaching flame. They then ballasted the stern to raise the prow, weighing down the vessel aft. Waiting for a wind blowing towards the mole, they fastened the vessel to triremes, which towed it before the breeze. As they neared the mole and towers, they set the wood ablaze. Simultaneously, the triremes violently ran the burning vessel aground against the end of the mole. The men on board easily swam away once it caught fire. A great flame quickly engulfed the towers. The twisting yardarms poured their flammable contents into the fire. Men in triremes near the mole continued to shoot arrows into the towers, making it unsafe to approach and quench the fire. With the towers ablaze, many Tyrians rushed from the city, embarked in light vessels, and struck various parts of the mole, easily tearing down the protective stockade and burning war engines the fire from the vessel hadn't reached. Alexander then began constructing a wider mole from the mainland, capable of holding more towers, and ordered engineers to prepare new engines. While this was done, he took his shield-bearing guards and Agrianians, and went to Sidon to collect all available triremes. It was clear that the siege would be far more difficult as long as the Tyrians maintained naval superiority. Around this time, Gerostratus, king of Aradus, and Enalus, king of Byblos, learned their cities were under Alexander's control. They deserted Autophrodates and his fleet, bringing their naval forces to Alexander, accompanied by Sidonian triremes. This brought Alexander about 80 Phoenician ships. Simultaneously, triremes also arrived from Rhodes, one called Peripolis and 9 others. 3 came from Soli and Malas, and 10 from Lycia. From Macedonia, a ship with 50 oars arrived, carrying Proteas, son of Andronicus. Not long after, the kings of Cyprus sailed into Sidon with about 120 ships, terrified by news of Darius's defeat at Issus, and the fact that all of Phoenicia was now Alexander's. Alexander granted indemnity to all for their past conduct, as they seemed to have joined the Persian fleet out of necessity rather than choice. While war engines were being built and ships prepared for a naval attack and battle, Alexander took some cavalry squadrons, Agrianians, and archers, and led an expedition into the anti-Lebanon mountain range. After subduing some mountaineers by force and others by capitulation, he returned to Sidon in 10 days. There he found Oleander, son of Polemocrates, who had just arrived from the Peloponnese with 4,000 Greek mercenaries. When his fleet was arranged, Alexander embarked enough shield-bearing guards as seemed sufficient, unless a sea battle was to be fought by breaking the enemy's line rather than close combat. He then sailed from Sidon towards Tyre with his ships in formation. He commanded the right wing, extending seaward, joined by the Cypriot kings and all the Phoenicians except Nitageras, who, with Craterus, commanded the left wing. The Tyrians had previously decided to fight a sea battle if Alexander attacked by sea. But they were astonished by the vast number of his ships, having not yet learned that Alexander had secured all Cypriot and Phoenician vessels. They were also surprised to see his fleet sailing in proper formation. Alexander's fleet paused for a while in the open sea before nearing the city, hoping to draw the Tyrians out to battle. When the enemy did not emerge, despite their formation, Alexander's fleet advanced with powerful strokes. Seeing this, the Tyrians decided against a sea battle. They instead blocked the harbor mouths with as many triremes as they could, guarding them to prevent the enemy fleet from anchoring. Since the Tyrians did not engage at sea, Alexander sailed near the city, but chose not to force entry into the Sidon-facing harbor due to its narrow mouth and the many triremes blocking it, prows facing him. However, the Phoenicians attacked 3 triremes moored furthest out at the harbor mouth. Attacking prow to prow, they sank them. The men on these ships easily swam to the friendly shore. Alexander then moored his ships along the shore near the mole, where there was shelter from the winds. The next day, he ordered the Cypriots, with their ships and Admiral Andromachus, to moor opposite the Sidon-facing harbor. The Phoenicians were positioned opposite the Egypt-facing harbor, on the other side of the mole, where Alexander's tent was located. He had now gathered many engineers from Cyprus and all of Phoenicia, and numerous war engines had been constructed, some on the mole, others on horse transport vessels brought from Sidon, and still others on slower triremes. When all preparations were complete, they brought the war engines along the mole and began firing from ships moored near various parts of the wall, testing its strength. The Tyrians erected wooden towers on their battlements opposite the mole to harass the enemy. If war engines approached other sections, they defended themselves with missiles and shot fire-bearing arrows at the ships, deterring the Macedonians from nearing the wall. The walls opposite the mole were about 150 feet high, proportionally broad, and built with large stones embedded in gypsum. The Macedonian horse transports and triremes, carrying war engines to the wall, struggled to approach the city due to a large quantity of stones hurled into the sea, obstructing their assault. Alexander decided to remove these stones from the sea. This was a difficult task, performed from ships rather than solid ground, especially as the Tyrians, covering their ships with armor, brought them alongside the triremes' anchors, cutting the anchor cables and making anchoring impossible for the enemy ships. Alexander armored many 30-oared vessels in the same way, placing them across in front of the anchors to repel the Tyrian ships. Yet, divers secretly cut their cables underwater. The Macedonians then used chains for their anchors instead of cables, preventing further harm from the divers. Then, fastening slipknots to the stones, they dragged them out of the sea from the mole. Using cranes, they lifted them and discharged them into deep water, where they no longer posed a threat by being hurled forward. The ships could now easily approach the cleared section of the wall. The Tyrians, facing dire straits on all sides, resolved to attack the Cypriot ships moored opposite the Sidon-facing harbor. For a long time, they spread sails across the harbor mouth to conceal the manning of their triremes. Around midday, when sailors were dispersed for supplies, and Alexander typically retired from the fleet to his tent on the other side of the city, they filled 3 quinquiremes, 3 quadriremes, and 7 triremes with their most expert rowers and best-armed fighting men, along with their most daring naval combatants. Initially, they rowed out slowly and quietly in single file, moving their oar handles without any signal from the timekeepers. But when they were tacking against the Cypriots and close enough to be seen, they attacked with loud shouts, mutual encouragement, and impetuous rowing. On that day, Alexander had gone to his tent, but quickly returned to his ships, not lingering as was his custom. The Tyrians suddenly fell upon the moored ships, finding some entirely empty and others being filled with difficulty by the men present during the noise and attack. In the first assault, they immediately sank the quinquereme of King Nitageras, that of Androcles the Amathusian, and that of Pasicrates the Curian. They shattered other ships by pushing them ashore. When Alexander saw the Tyrian triremes sailing out, he ordered most of his ships to be manned and positioned at the harbor mouth to prevent the rest of the Tyrian ships from sailing out. He then took his quinqueremes and about 5 triremes, quickly manned before the others were ready, and sailed around the city against the Tyrians who had emerged from the harbor. The men on the wall, seeing the enemy attack and Alexander himself in the fleet, shouted to their ships, urging them to return. But their shouts were inaudible over the noise of the battle. They then used various signals to exhort them to retreat. At last, perceiving Alexander's approaching fleet, they tacked on and fled into the harbor. A few ships escaped, but Alexander's vessels attacked the majority, disabling some. A quinquereme and a quadrireme were captured at the harbor mouth itself. The slaughter of the marines was not great. Seeing their ships captured, they easily swam into the harbor. With the Tyrians no longer able to receive aid from their ships, the Macedonians now brought their military engines directly to the wall. Those brought near the city along the mole caused little damage due to the wall's strength there. Other ships carrying military engines were brought opposite the Sidon-facing part of the city. But meeting no success even there, Alexander moved to the wall projecting towards the south wind in Egypt, testing the strength of the fortifications everywhere. Here a large section of the wall was severely shaken, and a part of it broke and fell. For a short time, he tried to assault this breach, throwing a bridge upon it, but the Tyrians easily repelled the Macedonians. 3 days later, waiting for a calm sea, and after encouraging his regiment leaders, Alexander led the ships carrying military engines up to the city. First, he shook down a large piece of the wall. When the breach seemed wide enough, he ordered the engine-bearing vessels to retire and brought up 2 others carrying his bridges, which he intended to throw across the breach. The shield-bearing guards occupied one vessel, commanded by Admetus. The other was occupied by Caenus's regiment, the foot companions. Alexander himself, with the shield-bearing guards, intended to scale the wall where possible. He ordered some of his triremes to sail against both harbors to see if they could force an entrance while the Tyrians were occupied with him. He also ordered triremes carrying missile engines or archers on deck to sail completely around the wall, putting in wherever possible, and taking positions within shooting range until entry was impossible. This was to distract the Tyrians, shooting at them from all sides, so they wouldn't know where to turn in their distress. When Alexander's ships drew close to the city, and the bridges were thrown from them upon the wall, the shield-bearing guards valiantly mounted the wall along these bridges. Their captain, Admetus, proved brave on that occasion, and Alexander accompanied them, both as a courageous participant and a witness to brilliant and dangerous acts of valor performed by others. The first part of the wall captured was where Alexander had positioned himself. The Tyrians were easily beaten back as soon as the Macedonians gained firm footing and an accessible entry point. Admetus was the first to mount the wall, but while cheering on his men, he was struck by a spear and died on the spot. After him, Alexander and the companions gained possession of the wall. With some towers and the sections of wall between them in his hands, he advanced through the battlements to the royal palace, as the descent into the city seemed easiest from there. Returning to the fleet, the Phoenicians stationed opposite the Egypt-facing harbor, where they were moored, forced their way in, breaking the harbor bars. They shattered the ships in the harbor, attacking some in deep water and driving others ashore. The Cypriots also sailed into the other harbor, facing Sidon, which had no bar, and swiftly captured that side of the city. The main body of the Tyrians abandoned the wall when they saw it in enemy hands. Rallying opposite what was called the Chapel of Aegean, they turned to resist the Macedonians. Alexander advanced against them with his shield-bearing guards, destroying those who fought there and pursuing those who fled. Great slaughter was also inflicted by those entering the city from the harbor and by Caenus's regiment, which had also entered. The Macedonians, enraged by the siege's length, and because the Tyrians had captured some of their men sailing from Sidon, conveyed them to the top of their wall, slaughtered them visibly from the camp, and cast their bodies into the sea. About 8,000 Tyrians were killed. Of the Macedonians, besides Admetus, who proved a valiant man and was the first to scale the wall, 20 shield-bearing guards were killed in the assault. In the entire siege, about 400 Macedonians died. Alexander granted amnesty to all who fled for refuge into the temple of Heracles. Among them were most of the Tyrian magistrates, including King Asimilcus, as well as Carthaginian envoys who had come to their mother city for the sacrifice in honor of Heracles, a long-standing custom. The rest of the prisoners, about 30,000 Tyrians and mercenary troops, were sold into slavery. Alexander then offered sacrifice to Heracles and led a procession in honor of the deity with all his soldiers fully armed. The ships also participated in this religious procession for Heracles. He also held gymnastic contests in the temple and celebrated a torch race. The military engine that had battered down the wall was brought into the temple and dedicated as a thank-off. The Tyrian ship sacred to Heracles, captured in the naval attack, was also dedicated to the god. An inscription was placed on it, whether composed by Alexander himself or another, but as it is not noteworthy, I have not described it. Thus, Tyre was captured in the month of Hecatombean, when Anabasis was archon at Athens. Chapter 7. Conquest of Gaza. While Alexander was still besieging Tyre, ambassadors arrived from Darius. They offered 10,000 talents for his mother, wife, and children. They also proposed that all territory west of the Euphrates, as far as the Grecian Sea, would be Alexander's, and suggested he marry Darius's daughter, becoming his friend and ally. When these proposals were presented to Alexander's companions, Parmenio reportedly advised Alexander that if he were in Alexander's shoes, he would gladly end the war on such terms and avoid further risk. Alexander is said to have replied that he would do the same if he were Parmenio, but since he was Alexander, he would respond differently. He stated he needed no money from Darius, and would not accept a part of his territory instead of the whole, for all Darius's money and territory were already his. He added that if he wished to marry Darius's daughter, he would do so even if Darius refused. He commanded Darius to come to him if he desired any generous treatment. Upon hearing this, Darius despaired of reaching an agreement and began new preparations for war. Alexander now resolved to move into Egypt. All other parts of what was called Palestine Syria had already submitted to him. However, a eunuch named Battus, who held the city of Gaza, ignored him. Battus hired Arabian mercenaries and had long stored enough provisions for a lengthy siege. He was confident the city could never be taken by storm and refused to admit Alexander. Gaza lies about 20 stades from the sea. The approach is sandy and over heavy soil, and the sea near the city is everywhere shallow. Gaza was a large city, built on a high mound, surrounded by a strong wall. It is the last city a traveler encounters when going from Phoenicia to Egypt, situated on the edge of the desert. When Alexander arrived near Gaza, he first encamped where the wall seemed easiest to attack and ordered his military engines constructed. His engineers, however, believed the wall was impregnable due to the mound's height. Yet, the more impossible it seemed, the more determined Alexander became. He declared that its capture would greatly alarm the enemy, being contrary to their expectations, while failure would disgrace him among both Greeks and Darius. He resolved to build a mound completely around the city, high enough to bring his military engines level with the walls. The mound was built primarily against the city's southern wall, where an assault seemed easiest. When he believed the mound was level with the walls, the Macedonians placed their military engines upon it and brought them close to Gaza's wall. At this time, as Alexander was offering sacrifice, crowned with a garland and about to begin the first sacred rite, a carnivorous bird flew over the altar. It dropped a stone it carried in its claws, which struck Alexander on the head. Alexander asked Aristander, the soothsayer, about this omen. Aristander replied, "O king, you will indeed capture the city, but you must take care of yourself this day." Alexander heeded this, staying near the military engines, out of missile range. But when a vigorous sortie was made from the city, and the Arabs carried torches to set fire to the engines, simultaneously hurling missiles from their elevated position at the Macedonians below, driving them from the mound, Alexander either deliberately disobeyed the soothsayer or forgot the prophecy in the excitement of battle. Taking his shield-bearing guards, he rushed to the rescue where the Macedonians were hardest pressed, preventing their disgraceful flight from the mound. However, he was himself wounded by a catapult bolt, which passed through his shield and breastplate into his shoulder. When he realized Aristander had spoken truly about the wound, he rejoiced, believing he would also capture the city with the soothsayer's aid. Nevertheless, he did not recover easily from the wound. Meanwhile, the military engines with which he had captured Tyre arrived by sea. He ordered the mound to be constructed entirely around the city, 2 stades wide and 250 feet high. When his engines were prepared and brought along the mound, they shook down a large section of the wall. Mines were dug in various places, and earth stealthily removed, causing many parts of the wall to collapse into the emptied spaces. The Macedonians then commanded a wide area with their missiles, driving back the defenders from the towers. Despite this, the city's defenders withstood 3 assaults, though many were killed or wounded. But at the 4th attack, Alexander led the Macedonian phalanx from all sides. He threw down the undermined section of the wall and battered down another large portion with his engines, making the assault easy through the breaches with scaling ladders. The ladders were brought to the wall, and great rivalry arose among the valiant Macedonians to be the first to scale it. Neoptolemus, one of the companions from the family of the Aeacidae, was the first. After him, one rank followed another with their officers. Once some Macedonians were inside the wall, they successively forced open the gates they came upon, admitting the entire army into the city. Though their city was now in enemy hands, the Gazaeans stood together and fought. Every man died fighting where he had been stationed. Alexander sold their wives and children into slavery. He repopulated the city with neighboring settlers, using it as a fortified post for the war.